But in the end, we only ended up having 82 because there was 3 people that didn't turn up. Yeah. Yeah, well, the staff said to me, I said, oh, look, we've got another one. This was like the 3rd time. And she said, oh, well, I'll just have to check, like, with my manager. I said, well, no, like, you have to feed them. I said, I can't turn them away. You have to feed them. I said, I don't care what they eat. They just have to be fed something. And she was like, okay. So, yeah, so they were really good. So that's good. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so at the moment we've got, so Rosemary's, your talk's still coming in a minute, isn't it?
It should be on its way.
Which
Or it should have arrived.
will be emailed to me and then I'll take it and put it on there.
Yep.
Sarah's is on there. Manu is on there, and I don't know about Taft, whether she came yesterday or not.
Where do you want us to stand when we're talking?
We have we got, I've got another card from yesterday.
Because to some degree, I wouldn't mind being able to see.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah, well, you can just stand behind them, we don't even
Although does this do the split screen? So if you're standing here, does the mic pick you up? Oh, you've got a...
Oh, you'll have the lapel, yeah.
I'm not. I will.
Oh, so many microphones in here.
So many microphones, yeah.
I guess when there's questions, should we both be running it?
Yeah.
Because it's such a big
Yeah, I can
spot. Anyway. Or like, should we both be? So there's microphones. Should we both be?
Yeah,
This is, yeah, it's just my phone. Yeah. But you can do the changeover. And I'll do the slides. Yeah. And then we'll both do running microphones. Okay.
So, Sarah's... So that's Manu's there. Do you want them in a folder?
Yeah, I think that'd be easy.
I'll have a sticker somewhere in here.
This one is
So Manu is number 3.
Yeah,
Does that help?
yeah. Thing numbers. Yeah, because it makes it much easier.
So Sarah, I can see should be on this one now. I think it was on the desktop.
Morning, everyone.
There's multiple things.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, you've got the clicker!
Yeah. So,
mine's-
so
that's-
Nobby, when I've got them, do you have the spare
We're
one?
doing a PDF, but that's all the fonts.
Or maybe it's in my wallet still. It might be in my wallet.
Just trying to find it right
Yeah,
now.
that's okay.
Oh, yeah, that's
Oh, I thought I
coming,
did, but I
there is
wasn't
one on
100%
here
sure.
It doesn't matter. It's supposed to be.
USB.
Sarah, is that Sarah's?
Here we go, guys.
So can you explain, can you guys explain
That's what I'm thinking. Today? You want to keep that up?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do.
You watch my photos and still plan that shit. Are you starting it now? I'll get a photo of the crowd.
Just double check with Sandy that she's okay starting it now. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. We're going to start, even though there's still people coming in with their morning coffees. Welcome to day 2, the last day of the NRM Science Conference. Leslie Hughes said yesterday that we broke a record in Adelaide yesterday for the hottest April day on record, and we're going to break that again today, which is not a, well, it's not a happy thing, is it? So, a bit of housekeeping. It actually is an extreme fire risk day in Adelaide today, so we've got a very hot morning and early afternoon, then the wind will pick up this afternoon. So in the event there is a fire, run through either of these doors or the 2 back doors. If half the audience suddenly disappears, it's because all our fireys are on call. We have the graphical abstract competition being finalised today as well. So all of those graphical abstracts are in the marquees. So if you'd like to have a look and vote, and the winner will be announced after lunch today. So first up, I'm going to introduce Rosemary Bissett, who is, I'm going to read this out, is the Head of Sustainability, Governance and Risk at the National Australia Bank. Thanks, Rosemary. Oh, you need to go back to start. Good morning. What I would like to do today is actually give you a little bit of an overview of work the finance sector is starting
to look at climate risks and opportunities and to consider that in the context of our lending portfolios and therefore the credit risk that we might be exposed to if climate risks impacts on the likelihood of our customers defaulting. But to do that, I want to put that in a context a little bit of NAB's journey and why we joined this pilot group of 16 international banks. And, okay, that one. So we'll skip that slide just to move it quickly. Our environmental agenda has 3 key focus areas. So maybe 5 or 6 years back, we wanted to revise it and we decided that we should be focusing on the key environmental challenges that we see around us in society and the world. And so that meant we came up with 3 things: climate change, natural value, which is our language for saying natural capital, and resource scarcity. So we believe they're the three of the key challenges that we need to focus on to help reduce environmental impacts on the planet, see a positive impact on the environment, and that's because we understand that environment underpins the economy. So our climate change strategy then, coming out of that, has 4 focus areas, and we revised them last year in light of the and here's another acronym for people who who want new acronyms: the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, so the TCFD. So rather than say that mouthful, I apologise, I'm going to say TCFD quite a bit. So in light of the TCFD, we looked at how we wanted to approach climate change. And what they were saying was good climate change management. We could tick most of the boxes on all of those things. And we reframed the strategy. So leadership commitments is part of it. So if you go and pick up NAB's sustainability report, you'll see that we've committed to provide 55 billion in environmental finance by 2025. 20 of that is for things like project finance for renewable energies, asset finance for equipment that's energy efficient, etc., and for things like green bonds. The other 35 relates to mortgages and the 6-star mortgages, either new homes or the ones that are being renovated. And so 35 billion is a big number, but that's actually one of the key areas where our greenhouse emissions are growing as we have a growing population and everybody needs somewhere to live. So we wanted to focus on that, and that's let us sort of understand what's happening in that market by looking at that data. And recently we've had a green mortgage-backed bond go into the market, and there's a real hunger in the investment industry to be able to access finance for things that they know will contribute to environmental well-being or positive impact. So leadership commitments is part of it, and in that, doing the right thing ourselves and leading by example is really key. So we made a commitment to having 50% of our electricity consumption in Australia coming from renewables by 2025. Then next part is actually developing climate change knowledge and insights, and the TCFD pilot is part of actually learning how to do this stuff and understand climate data in the context of being a financial institution and how that changes risk and creates opportunities. So one of the things, we'll talk about some examples of that later. And then supporting our customers through the transition. We're a minnow in terms of our emissions and our impacts, because we have office footprints in built environments, in urban environments. But when you actually look at our ability to influence our customers, that becomes a really material opportunity. Then we need to invest in organisational capability. Talking about environmental risk and climate change is not the everyday conversation for a banker. So looking for those opportunities and talking about those risks is something that we need to really focus hard on building knowledge internally. I've mentioned the 55 billion. So some examples of these sorts of things. We've had a number of climate bonds and green bonds that have now gone out into the market. We helped the Victorian government with advice on actually structuring their green bond, which paid for things like water treatment and renewable energy, etc. in Victoria. In terms of developing climate change knowledge and insights. One of the things we've done is to run a forum for our customers on power purchasing agreements as they're thinking about renewable energy. That had something like 400 people in the audience in one of our sort of building venues. And we could have probably doubled it and it might run again. So the hunger for people to actually know how to do some of this, to be able to share knowledge with our customers and others, there's a huge knowledge gap, and people want to know how to do the right thing. And then there's reports and insights we can get from better understanding this that we can share with our customers. And we're learning from our customers too. So some of our customers have done scenario analysis, and so we're actually looking at how they've done it and what they've done. And we want to know, so part of my day job is helping the bankers look at the environmental, social and governance risks faced by our customers, so we can decide whether what our customers are doing in those areas is within our risk appetite to accept it. So do we want a relationship with them based on the way they manage their environmental and social performance? And then in terms of investing in organisational capability, we have a climate change working group. And what's different is that we're bringing together people from across the organisation. So in product areas, in corporate responsibility, in risk. We can't solve this even internally without combining people from everywhere to address the problems. We're occupying green buildings. We have a science-based target for the part of our emissions in our buildings and our activities that we can put in place a science-based target for, because there's no methodology for what you get from a data centre. We've just covered what we can do in our buildings and our vehicles and things. So we've got to actually contribute to development of some of these methodologies so we can actually work out what is our goal, what do we need to achieve to get to that 2 degree target. We've improved our reporting and disclosure, and we're investing in renewable energy, and we have quite a few research partnerships to help us across our environmental agenda, but on climate change as well. So 2 examples of research partnerships. We're going to participate in the Energy Transitions Hub so that we actually understand the options for Australia in terms of the transition to low carbon. And that we want to engage our customers in. And we're also involved with Climate Kick, and that's looking at standards for green bonds, particularly one on adaptation finance. So these are new areas where banks are actually, and financial institutions are extremely interested. And I think now more than ever, business and science need to work hand in hand. One of the issues you'll hear as I go through the rest of the slides is that science is not really, in some ways, ready for business. Some of the data that is available is not in the formats and it's not accessible in a way that it readily translates to match up with financial information. So, background now on the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It was established by the Financial Stability Board probably 5 years ago. I remember talking to some senior executives in the finance sector and saying climate change is a material risk that we need to think about from a finance sector point of view. And the response I got was, yeah, maybe for some individual companies we should think about it, but until the regulators take notice of this and say it's an issue, you're not going to see people taking you seriously. And so the change that has taken place now in the financial community with the Financial Stability Board saying this is a systemic risk for the financial system. And now in Australia, APRA, I think Jeffrey Summerhays has done 2 speeches actually calling out for Australian financial institutions that they see it as a risk as well. It's actually changed the game so that now there will be a lot more conversations with finance sector players across the different segments, so banking, insurance, asset management and ownership, where people are trying to understand the impacts of climate change. So the purpose of the TCFD was to develop recommendations about more effective climate-related disclosures so that people, particularly investors, could understand climate risk in banking and financial portfolios. And so they, and for other companies too. So Their recommendations cover a range of corporates. They've got particular advice for certain sectors and a whole segment on financial institutions. So you can see in the diagrams here, their key recommendations are around governance, strategy, risk management and metrics. We won't go into the details, but if you pick up the report, you can actually see within those 4 areas, there's a certain set of recommendations at a very high level. For us, the actual novel one, where we hadn't really gone before, is describing the potential impact of different scenarios on business strategies and financial planning. And for us, in the banking world, it's stress testing our portfolios. In terms of what we've done to date, our sustainability report and our annual financial report, because the disclosures around risk now, the FSB's recommendations are out there, need to be in mainstream financial filings where investors can easily find it. So we've got a descriptive piece of information within the report of directors in our annual financial report, which goes through those 4 areas. So governance, strategy, risk management and metrics and targets, and explains the journey we're on, because we're not there yet and we can't fully describe those risks. Our investor presentation also provides specific information about parts of our portfolio that investors have told us they're interested in. So you can see data on our power generation portfolio, and it's really pleasing that it is more than 50%. It's up towards 60% of our portfolio for power generation is now to renewables. And we're showing the change in time in our portfolio to the mining sector as well. So these pieces of information are now being used by investors in their decisions and whether they invest in companies like NAB. In terms of the recommendations and from the TCFD and what they mean for banks, and I guess the novelty and complexity of it, it's a forward-looking risk assessment. When you read annual reports, they tend to talk about performance retrospectively, and forward-looking statements have considerable caveats on them. So this is actually very different in terms of being able to assess and look at forward-looking risks. It's expanding time horizons in a way that is outside the realms of normal stress testing that we do. When we're looking at stress testing the portfolio. Typically, you would look at 3 to 5 years in a stress test. So it's within the business planning horizon. For the exercise that the 16 banks are going through, we're going out to 2040. We're dealing with high levels of uncertainty and complexity. It's integrating science, and it's aligned to the 2-degree goal in the Paris Agreement. And the good thing is it's an opportunity to deal with risk in a proactive rather than a reactive way. And traditionally, if you're not looking into the future and you're not looking at emerging risks and understanding them well, then you can find you're caught in a reactive situation. So the 16 banks, I'm not going to go through them, but you can see the brands. And we have, it's being done under the banner of a membership organisation that we all belong to, which is the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative, which is a partnership between the UN Environment and the banking sector, or the finance sector globally. And there's 2 delivery partners or consultants working with the group of banks and UNEP-FI. Acclimatise is actually looking after the physical risk side of things. They're a science consultancy, and Oliver Wyman Mercer are looking after the transition risk work. And we're further ahead in that work with Oliver Wyman on transition risk, because getting the data we need for physical risk is hard. The project is focused on helping each member bank, so this is the goals and the outputs, assess and disclose climate-related risks and opportunities. At the moment, we're in that how do we do the assessment phase and piloting that. Then there'll be a discussion on what's our risk appetite around this for disclosure, because it's going to be new. And listening to some of our customers and corporates that have done this, they've actually spent a lot of time with their legal departments working out how they do their forward-looking disclosures. And then the really important piece is, and I look at many annual reports to compare performance in my day job, We need a comparable way. So stakeholders and investors that are reading these reports can actually see some sort of harmony in the way it's been done. So it's an early, I guess, bid to create a standardised approach to how you do this in the finance sector. An insurance pilot is just starting up, and there's the Principles for Responsible Investment is a member organisation for asset owners and managers, and they're also talking about a pilot. So the project outputs are to have jointly developed scenarios to describe what we think the climate scenarios are, to have some models that people can actually pull apart and look at so they can see what we've done, and we'll conduct other research as needed, and then to publish those in some way. The 4 areas of the recommendations, because we're not tackling them all, are the 3 strategy ones we're going to focus on, and the metrics and targets piece. And the key one that we're all focused on at the moment is in strategy, and it's number C, which is the bottom one on potential impacts of scenarios. We're looking at 3 scenarios. So we're looking at business as usual, which is 4 degrees, 2 degrees, and 1.5 degrees. And there's recognition that we'll see more physical risk in the 4-degree scenario, and there's more transition risk involved in the 1.5-degree scenario. Some of the key information and expertise required are around climate models, which is where we've had to talk to the scientists. And for transition risk at the moment, we've been working with the Potsdam Institute and some other scientific organisations that are working on integrated assessment models. So we are using integrated assessment models for this. Credit and sustainability experts, both internally and externally, and those in our bank that are involved on a day-to-day basis in modelling and stress testing. So another novelty of this is that we're needing to combine expertise and information from a wide range of sources. Typically, when you do a stress test, you look at macroeconomic variables, and that means that you're looking at sort of national indicators that you can change as you work out what the stress or impact would be on the banking portfolio. Here, that won't work, because when you look at climate impacts, they actually vary by sector. So we're actually, in the end, and then if you want to get it exact, you'd probably look at borrowers themselves, their individual customers. We're doing a combination of the two, because we need to calibrate sector level with some specific borrowers so that we can actually make sure that what we do at the sector level to reduce workload is reasonable. The type of approach we've taken is to look at which scenarios are most relevant. The sorts of things that helped us choose the scenarios were availability of the 3 scenarios we wanted, so 1.5, 2 and 4. The output coverage around geographies and sectors, the output granularity, being able to get down to a sector level in a scenario with the information that we needed, and the update frequency, thinking about it becoming something picked up by the finance sector globally. We've looked at what sort of metrics, and we're not doing every impact known to man. So for transition risk, we're looking at things like energy prices, carbon prices, investment required, and energy demand by fuel source. Those sort of, there's a group of about 5 pieces. For the physical risk, we're looking at things like flood, storms, wildfire, and we've found a good source of data for that can get us down to postcode level and potentially even to customer level. But at the moment, we're still hunting for a data source that we can use that would give us access to information on drought/water stress and heat. Because the insurance data sets that we can use that people don't insure about for heat events, so they don't have the historical data. Then we have to look at the impacts of those risk factors on each economic sector that we're looking at, and translate that sector performance and climate impact into corporate credit risk, and then overall aggregate that so we can see the impact on our portfolio. I think when we started, we thought we could do everything together, which is probably a bit naive, but we then very quickly realised we had to do physical and transition risk separately. Across the banking group, we've got 4 different sectors we've picked for physical risk, 4 for transition risk. Each bank's doing about 2 sectors each in each of those categories. So we're covering for physical risk, real estate, transport, agri and energy, which includes oil, gas and power. And then in transition risk, we're looking at mining and metals, transport, agriculture and energy. The countries across that group of banks vary and cover the globe. Not completely, but you've got sort of Latin America, North America, Europe, Australia, the Netherlands. So it's a mix, and we've now got to the point where we have draft methodologies that all of the banks are playing with. Key learnings. Access to the data, as I've mentioned, is really challenging and not typically available. The resolution of the climate change data is not always going down to a level where we can relate it to our customers. With some of the insurance data we can get on past events, we can get data that goes down to customer level. But then you've got the fact that if you're looking at mortgages and property impacts, then if you live in your house, then we know where the address is. But if you've got an investment property, then you could have a completely different address in our system to the one that we would need to look at the physical impact on the property. So actually the problems of marrying data up are significant. There's limited historical data that looks at the relationship between climate data and things like credit risk. So it's extremely novel. We can't go and get historical practices off the shelf. So we're trying to prove new relationships. I've talked about the problem of the time horizon. This is something really novel for our stress testing guys to get their head around, the fact that we're trying to think out to 2040. It's very time and labour intensive within the bank, and we need to use quite a bit of external assistance. What we need is something that's systematic, repeatable and consistent, so we can actually see this get picked up across our sector, and we can't do this without expert advice. So I was busy writing notes yesterday morning as I listened to the climate change areas, so that I could take that away and contact people later as we work out what we're going to do throughout this. So that's early days. At the moment, we're talking about how much we disclose in terms of the actual models that we've used and what we've done. We can talk about more with questions, and hopefully that gives you some insight into, I guess, the big problem that we're trying to solve and the reason why we going forward, the finance sector will be engaging significantly more with science.
Thank you, Rosemary. It's fantastic. We're going to save questions towards the end of the keynotes and maybe spill it over into the panel as well. Next up, we have Sarah Beckersey, Professor of Sustainability and Urban Planning at RMIT University in Melbourne. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. Thank you. Actually, I think I won't use this on the advice of Patrick that if I press the red button, it'll be a karaoke session rather than the next slide, which I might actually be more entertaining and perhaps even more adept at, at undertaking. But let's stick to the notes. I want to talk to you today about NRM science in the city. I'm going to argue that the complexity and the challenges and the rewards of doing natural resource management and parts of the landscape that we're kind of more used to addressing are sort of on steroids in cities. No other part of our landscape has the number and complexity of landholders, the intensity of economic demands, of social demands and environmental demands, and also the complexity of often competing laws and regulations and policies. And yet the benefits of doing it right in the city are totally, they're massive. Indeed, I'm going to argue that the future of habitable cities around the world, and in Australia in particular, really hinges on this kind of new conceptualisation of cities. So I want to talk about what I see as being a real perfect storm of ideas that are generating enormous enthusiasm for this idea of embracing nature in cities. Cities around the world, this is a picture of Melbourne and surrounds, beautiful Melbourne. This is Mexico City. Cities around the world are facing unprecedented challenges to maintaining basic livability. And that's driven, mostly by exponential population growth in our kind of urban areas. For some people and some cities, the challenges are about having clean air for people to breathe and clean water for people to drink. Other cities in Australia, it's about trying to contemplate habitability in the face of climate change. The increasingly serious threats of extreme weather events, high temperatures, storms, etc. But most, I'd say perhaps even all cities around the world are really struggling with all this exponential population growth, so many people interacting on a daily basis. How do we create cities that have happy people, healthy people, people who aren't anxious, stressed, disconnected? Healthy cities that are really focused on the well-being of people. And that's really what's driving this enthusiasm. Because there's a very strong but emerging body of evidence that reveals the potential of everyday nature, we like to call it, as part of the solution in this space. There've been some really high-profile successes, so things like the High Line in New York, the Garden Cities of Singapore. They've really galvanised interest among planners and architects and landscape designers as to best ways of incorporating nature in the very sort of fabric of a city. So I want to quickly take you through what I consider to be 5 really compelling reasons for embracing nature in a city. And the first one is linked to the fact that nature in our cities is good for us. And this used to be a new thing to talk about, but it seems like almost every day something else in the media is alerting to us to a new study that talks about yet another remarkable way that nature, engaging with nature is actually good for us. This all started in about mid-1980s when a guy called Roger Ehrlich found that people would recover faster from surgery in hospital if they actually had a view of nature from their window. And since then, there have been a truly remarkable range of studies that have showed the kind of array of benefits to people's health and well-being. So if you're a child and you live in a street with more nature, more street trees and more diversity of street trees, you'll have lower risk of asthma, lower risk of allergies. If your schoolyard as a child has biodiversity in it, you will have improved cognitive development. You'll have lower rates of ADHD. If you're an adult, you're less likely to die from heart disease if you're exposed to nature on a regular basis. So you'll have less of a risk of diabetes, of cancer. You'll sleep better. You'll have less stress and lower risk of poor mental health outcomes. You're more likely to live longer and have just general better health and well-being in a city with more biodiversity. Now, it's really interesting that it's not just the green, it's not just any old tree. It's actually, a lot of these particular studies that I've highlighted here are to do with biodiversity. They're to do with having diverse, and look, I find the idea that biodiversity is linked to health a really interesting question from a kind of mechanistic perspective. What's really driving this? And I think there's some interesting research even at the University of Adelaide looking at, I believe, soil microbiota and the role that it potentially play in delivering some of these health benefits. I think there'll be a lot of research in this space in the coming years, but whatever we find to be the mechanisms, the evidence is already highly compelling, and people are considering this as a kind of quite legitimate public health initiative. It's a relatively cheap public health initiative, and it has a whole suite of other co-benefits that I want to quickly talk about now. One of the major ones, which is really driving a lot of interest from cities around the world, is this idea that we can somehow future-proof our cities in the face of climate change. We know that cities are already warmer than their rural counterparts through the urban heat island effect, and this is exacerbated by climate change. cities are also threatened by, you know, a suite of issues: rising sea levels, extreme storms, variable rainfall, etc. And we know that vegetation can play a key role in the delivery of services to mitigate against and also adapt to, you know, warming conditions. This is a really interesting thermal heat image of the centre of Melbourne, where you can see under the trees about 30 degrees cooler than in the middle of the road. And in fact, across the city of Melbourne, with their urban greening strategy, urban forest strategy, believes that, and it's quite a kind of, you know, it's relatively ambitious, but it's not out of control. They think they can actually manage an 8 degrees cooling overnight in these heat wave events. These events, overnight temperatures are really critical to the mortality events that happen in heat waves. 8 degrees cooler, that's kind of pretty compelling. You know, we can reduce peaks in stormwater and alleviate, you know, flooding events. We can actually reduce energy consumption in buildings, and, you know, and sequester carbon. There was an interesting study that I failed to kind of put up here, but that I read a couple of weeks ago about city greening having the potential to sequester as much carbon per unit area as tropical rainforest. And yet, this is a bit of research that Natalie Butt and others and myself conducted a couple of years ago, or it just came out. We looked at all the cities around the world, their plans to adapt to climate change, and green infrastructure came out as being a really important, the third most kind of substantial investment strategy for cities. But practically no city actually mentions biodiversity in that context. So I think we're on the cusp of a very big missed opportunity if we don't jump on this bandwagon and make sure that urban greening happens in a way that is compatible with other natural resource management objectives. And this is really important from a biodiversity perspective, because cities, we know, can be hotspots for threatened species. This is a study that we conducted a couple of years ago that looked at urban versus rural areas, and we found that there are about 3 times the number of threatened species per unit area in cities as there are in the equivalent kind of rural areas. Some species are completely restricted to cities, like this is the poor old Frankston spider orchid. Other species are just dependent on cities for resources, and in fact kind of have moved into cities due to the lack of resources elsewhere in the landscape. But, you know, it's what is definitely true is that cities and our actions in cities to conserve threatened species are going to be the survival or otherwise of a whole bunch of threatened species. So that, in my opinion, they are totally justifiable places for doing conservation, even for its own sake. The fourth compelling reason, these are my kids a few years ago now, in a grassland around Melbourne, is this idea that we can re-enchant people with nature. We all know about this, the extinction of experience, the fact that people spend less and less time outdoors in more and more depauperate environments. You know, adults who can name hundreds of company logos but only recognise a few sort of bird calls. And I think that creating opportunities for these everyday doses of nature in cities is one of our best chances. In fact, I'd say it's an unparalleled chance to re-enchant people with nature and to deliver to them all the benefits that I've been describing. The last compelling reason that I want to kind of argue is the idea that urban greening should be a really significant opportunity to engage with Indigenous history and culture. And at this point in time, I really would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, because traditional knowledge in this context is absolutely critical. Indigenous knowledge is very rarely used in planning, despite the fact that it has such obvious kind of benefits to cities and its surrounding landscapes. There's, I think, substantial potential to engage Indigenous people in the design, in the implementation and the governance of urban forest and renaturing opportunities. What does this mean in practice? Well, in Melbourne, we're looking at trying to rewild the city with species of cultural significance. The yam daisy, for example, a really important food source, a traditional food source. Or species that highlight cultural stories, or even this is a moth that signifies the start of one of the 7 Wurundjeri seasons, and it used to emerge in vast numbers in Melbourne, and wanting to kind of bring it back as a way of kind of reconnecting people with the fact that Melbourne has 7 seasons, and this moth is going to signify the start of one of them. That's re-enchantment. Playgrounds, nature-based playgrounds that kind of highlight Indigenous stories, and this one in next to the hospital in Melbourne is built around the 7 seasons concept, and it's a really great place to take your kids if you're ever in Melbourne. And this is a project that we're sort of kicking off as part of the Threatened Species Hub, which is to do with totem species in schools. So engaging school children in the traditional concept of you know, having a totem species bestowed on the school, having to learn the science of habitat creation, of dispersal, and you know, how are we going to get this thing to come back to our school? How are we going to involve the community to be part of that solution? Understanding the cultural stories around totem species, which in my mind is one of the key reasons why we've kind of lost the plot with conservation, and the fact that that spiritual connection to nature is got to be so much a critical component of why we care. They'll look after you, you look after them. It worked for many, many years in this country. Let's bring it back as a concept. So yeah, I think it ticks a lot of kind of really excellent boxes, this Totem Species in Schools project. I'm really excited about kicking it off. All right, so hopefully I've convinced you that there are some very compelling reasons for wanting to bother with natural resource management, in particular nature enhancement in cities. But for anyone who's actually worked in this space at all, the pathways to achieving this vision are not always straightforward. I think a really important first step in all of this is to challenge the way that nature is often considered in its entirety in the planning process. So rather than, you'll often see biodiversity being talked about as a constraint. There'll be a biodiversity constraint layer, or, you know, basically it's a problem to be dealt with, you know. How are we going to manage this problem? No, we have to stop using that language and remove all of that language from the planning system. It is a massive asset, something we have to maximise at every stage of the planning process. We need to carefully regulate to protect our remnants and to protect single trees. Otherwise, we know how easily nature can be whittled away in cities, and issues like public safety so easily trump the kind of idea that there's worth in maintaining trees in cities. One of my absolute bugbears is the fact that our main instrument that we use to manage remnant biodiversity in cities is offsetting. Now, this is a complete policy fail when it comes to actually thinking about providing nature, everyday doses of nature. The idea that we can clear the vegetation in communities and offset it to somewhere that's going to be probably cheaper and usually far away from where people actually live really misses that opportunity for people to connect to nature, to be re-enchanted by nature. So we don't talk about offsets, we talk about onsets. And we've developed a protocol called Biodiversity Sensitive Urban Design that seeks to take the nature that's existing on a site and enhance it through development. Now that means that it may sound utopian, but we're doing this with some developers in and around Melbourne at the moment. And because a lot of these environments are quite degraded to start with, it's entirely feasible, and it's a really exciting concept. So our protocol is a scientifically driven protocol that's linked to the persistence of species and the viability of species, and it links design, construction and habitation phases to tangible increases in the likelihood that things are going to persist on the site into the future. Planning for everyday nature means broadening our perceptions of what counts as nature. Scrappy bits of spontaneous nature can be as important to people as, you know, quite intact remnants sometimes, especially if they're actually right where people are living and working. We can use habitat analogues in cities to provide nesting and food resources. This is a really fantastic example of a brick that's used in a high-rise building, I think in New York, And the birds can nest in this side and people can observe them nesting from the other side inside the building. We've been working a lot with architects, which has been really kind of challenging and interesting. Certainly the fashion stakes are definitely raised. Everyone has extremely excellent spectacles when you go to sit in meetings. But it's been a really exciting project, actually flipping the way that architects have often thought about buildings, which is about keeping nature out, into a philosophy of bringing nature back, inviting and making spaces for not having spiky bits on the top of buildings to keep pigeons off, but actually having places for possums to live and exist, or birds to nest, and using that as a way of creating far more livable space for humans at the same time. One of these projects that we've just completed is actually, for anyone who knows anything about architecture, this is impressive. For everyone else, this will just sound like really boring. But it's being featured as the Australian exhibition at the Venice Biennale. The other thing we can do is really think carefully about bringing species back into the city. This is something we're doing with the City of Melbourne at the moment, helping them through a kind of decision model, come up with the best species that are going to be ecologically feasible, socially acceptable, and also this important thing of having strong cultural significance. This is such an exciting project to be involved in. Creating opportunities for people to engage with nature needs to be where they live and where they play and where they travel. So obviously we're always going to have the importance of remnant patches, big parklands and waterways is always going to be core to city kind of nature. But it's also about thinking creatively about streetscapes, for example, about backyards, green walls, green roofs, roundabouts, pop-up parks, schoolyards, transport routes, office courtyards. This is all stuff where we can have everyday nature. And there are so many creative strategies to achieving this. We've got a project on pollinator observatories. It's a really kind of cool citizen science concept around Melbourne. Wildlife gardening, this student of mine showed the incredible aspects of people engaging with developing, encouraging wildlife in their own gardens, better than going to a psychiatrist, apparently. We can all be much better at engaging with different audiences than we usually do as natural resource managers or scientists. So, for example, we just published this little Things That Run the City. It's a children's book that came out of a survey we did of the insects of Melbourne. I mean, how much more boring can you get? This book sold 1,000 copies. It's a kid's book that just has some beautiful artwork of the insects of Melbourne. Urban form is critical in this space. We need active, walkable streetscapes, buildings that are designed at the human scale, providing incidental everyday engagement with nature. So not this, urban sprawl, not this, massive high-rise, not the infill that we see currently in the middle ring suburbs that are kind of really low yield in terms of extra houses, but massive impact on biodiversity and amenity. But this, sustainable mid-rise that has semi-private spaces where people can feel stewardship of the land, designed so that people can yell out the window and see their kids. That's a really strong planning mantra. The kind of yelling out the window to your kids kind of rule. If you can't see them, you can't yell to them, then it's not a good planning approach to actually encouraging everyday nature. It encourages everyday nature, but it's also extremely compatible with just highly livable and excellent communities for human habitation. Right, renaturing cities is not always going to be completely seamless. And we need to carefully manage obstacles, problems and conflicts. Some architects and planners and engineers are not going to be used to this, and we have to kind of really work with them. There's so much wrong with this. This is scientific pest and vegetation management. I took a picture of it to kind of demonstrate the sort of attitudes that you can come up against. There's so much wrong with it. I mean, one of the things that I really wonder is, what a Ulysses butterfly has ever done to anyone? But anyway. Well, the Corella-geddon hits Melbourne. I think this is the same thing that's happened in Adelaide, right? Oof, where to start? I mean, what if we lost the possums and the Corellas and the things about our cities that actually make them uniquely Australian? Do we really want to have a city like any other global kind of place. I mean, I think our wildlife is what makes our cities completely unique. Why don't we see Traffic-ageddon, or, you know, relentless renovation-ageddon, or bloody Harley-Davidson driver-ageddon? You know, I mean, why do people kind of put up with all that crap, and yet Corellas are somehow kind of, you know, a massive, you know, totally... Anyway, I'll calm down. I'll calm down. Let me finish. I just need to say that I've tried to outline really exciting possibilities and opportunities for what I think is kind of unleashing the potential of nature in our cities. Highlighting on one hand the kind of myriad benefits that designing cities for everyday nature have for people, and at the same time, you know, the critical role that cities have for maintaining threatened species. And I think that the future of our cities, the future of habitable, livable, fantastic cities that are Australian in character and nature and we can feel pride of place in, really depends on this new conceptualisation of urban landscapes where nature can thrive and people can enjoy every day the benefits that nature can deliver. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. That was incredible. I'm hoping that we can continue to, I guess, draw on your expertise as Adelaide hopefully becomes more green. Next we have Dr. Manu Saunders from New England University, who is an ecologist specialising in ecosystem services.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. So today I just want to talk a bit about sustainable agriculture. It's a nice ambiguous term that is used in a multitude of ways for various things. So what is it? What does it mean? Why do we need to change agriculture as it currently stands? So this is a diagram from a team out of the Stockholm Resilience Centre. It's essentially, it's the planetary boundaries concept. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. So it essentially is a communication tool to show what we need to be doing with how we're managing landscapes and the earth in general to create a livable planet. So ideally, we want to be within this green space in the middle. These are all biophysical, ecological factors that create sustain life on Earth. So to continue sustaining life on Earth, we want to remain within that green space. So based on recent analyses, we've already overshot a number of these factors, and the most recent analysis, so that Campbell paper that I've got there actually has looked at the drivers of why this is happening, and intensive agriculture is the key driver for these particular red wedges that are not very good for us. So we need to change how we're approaching agriculture. A related concept is this Kate Rayworth's Donut Economics, which was, she's just published this last year, but it's been talking about it for a while. It builds on that planetary boundaries concept, but it integrates the social foundation of our society with the ecological boundaries that we saw in the previous diagram. So essentially works the same way. We move out from the centre. In an ideal society, we want to be achieving these basic social foundations that are essential for human well-being. So they're in the centre of the donut. And then we also can't overshoot these particular ecological ceilings on these environmental factors. So the green bit is the safe and just space for humanity. So that's where we want to be, within that green bit. If we're inside the hole, we're shortfall, and if we overshoot those boundaries, that's not great either. So this team from Leeds University has used this concept to analyse the footprints of countries around the world. You can go and I recommend going to the website there and checking this out. So this graph is interactive and you can actually see which country is where. I've just circled Australia so we can see how we're going. So ideally, we want to be, everyone should be up here in this top left corner where we're achieving all the social thresholds and not transgressing many or at all the biophysical boundary. So this country's the closest, that's Vietnam. Australia's not doing so well. And you can actually get a little diagram like this for each country to see how they compare. So even though we're doing really well with human wellbeing, we've achieved all the social thresholds to live the good life that we want to live, we're actually overshooting on all but one of these biophysical natural resource footprints. So I'm not presenting this as a doom and gloom. It's not intended to be depressing. It's actually, I see communication tools like that as inspiring and positive communication tool. They motivate us to actually do something about what's happening. It's not throw your hands up in despair. So there are solutions for these problems that intensive agriculture is causing. There's a lot of evidence showing all of these things on this screen, concepts and various individual practices plus many more that aren't on there, have been proven to work in various contexts. The important thing is that not everything works everywhere, and this is why sustainable agriculture is such a complex, nuanced term. So the key point to remember with sustainable agriculture is it's about quality, not quantity. So there's a myth about increasing yields. We hear it a lot in the media, but not just the media. We hear it from scientists and business and farmers and all sorts of sectors in society. This statement, we need to grow more food, we need to produce more food. That's actually not true. Recent analyses show that globally we are producing plenty of food, and we all, I'm sure everyone watched this wonderful show last year on ABC, The War on Waste. In the news recently has been about the grain glut in North America. There's so much grain being produced it can't be sold, affecting farmers' livelihoods, etc. So we don't need to increase yields, we don't need to grow more food, we need to improve the quality of that food, how it's grown, not just nutritionally, but also in terms of the environmental impact that it's having through production, and also access and distribution of food. So to do this, we actually need to approach the food system as an entire system, not as individual parts, which traditionally happens. And the ecosystem services concept and understanding what ecosystem services are and how we can enhance them is essential to achieving these sustainable agriculture goals. Just quick snapshot of what the, I guess, political system is here, which most of us already are aware of. So Australian agriculture is obviously market-driven and export-oriented. So this does contribute to the idea of producing more yields because it's more profitable. That's the system that we live in. We actually have very few policy support measures for sustainable agricultural practices. And so, I mean, subsidies and incentives aren't always the answer, and I'm not saying that that's what should be happening, but it does then, because there is very little governance and regulation from the Commonwealth level or even the state level, there is this onus on farmers and individuals to really choose to act as a land steward, and it is up to the individual farmer in many cases. And if there are few incentives, there becomes this issue of, well, you know, it is up to them and what capital they have behind them whether they choose to take on this stuff. So this is just from the FAO, their 5 principles of sustainable agriculture. I just like this diagram because it really does illustrate how interconnected the entire system is, from the environment that the food is, the environment that the food's actually grown in, through to the people that actually consume it. Everything is interconnected. And to achieve sustainable agriculture, we need to be achieving all 5 of these. We can't just be focusing on one at the expense of the others. The 5 work together in synergy. So farms are ecosystems, obviously. We similar to what Sarah was talking about with urban nature, trying to building buildings to keep nature out. It's a similar thing. We have a similar approach with agriculture. We're always trying to keep nature out of farms. The reality is that a lot of wild animals and plants, etc., can actually contribute benefits in farm environments. So this is just an example from some work we did on wild animal activity in farms. So there's this traditional view that wild animals are either good or bad. We focus on these simplistic labels. Bees are always good, aphids are always bad, birds are annoying and damage crops. The reality is far more complex, and individual species can be a pest in one system or beneficial in another system. You know, the effect that that animal has on the system can depend on how it's managed, etc. And this just illustrates that. So if we're thinking of net outcome as this is the yield that we want, the marketable yield that... She's this touchy little thing. So the marketable yield that the farmer wants to produce, that their livelihood depends on. So this wild animal activity on those farms, so what the diversity and abundance of those animals on the farms, what they're doing, how they interact across the growing season, provides both benefits and costs. So the idea is we want to be optimising the benefits, reducing the costs to produce this ideal outcome. But all of that is, of course, affected by all of these complex factors, and it's this ongoing cycle of building knowledge, adapting to that knowledge, and so on. A couple of quick examples from some work I've done. So these are the Armen landscapes in northwest Victoria, near Mildura. So almond is 100% reliant on insect pollination to produce optimal yields. So at the moment the industry uses rented honeybees, as I'm sure you're all aware. It's a cost of billions of dollars every year to the industry to rent honeybees. Surprisingly, there's actually been no published work on what wild pollinators are actually available to provide free pollination services. So I went out to these landscapes just to see what wild pollinators were there, where they were in the landscape, and if there was potential to use these for ecosystem services. So this landscape up in the top left that's Calignan Nangelock area, which is just south of Mildura. That's the Murray River, obviously. And this landscape is further around towards Robinvale, so that's Hattah Colquhoun National Park in there. Two very different landscapes. This one is a nice mosaic landscape, lots of different crops, horticultural crops grown in there, patches of remnant vegetation, smaller blocks, so you can see that each of those individual farms is a lot smaller than what's going on over here. This particular landscape is very homogeneous, so pretty much all of that through there is almonds, but then they have some nice intact areas of native vegetation as well. The different types of almond orchards I was comparing, so these are the monoculture intensive, large, thousands of hectares plantations versus the smaller orchards that have ground cover, a lot of other different crops growing on the farm, some of them are managed organically, etc. So not surprisingly, this isn't great habitat for pollinators. So, it looks like they're in flower, they look very pretty when they're in flower. But for the rest of the year, it's essentially a desert. There's nothing growing there because they do remove all the vegetation under the trees. So my work, and it's all been published, so I won't go into all the details of it, but it's essentially there were no wild pollinator species within these plantations. There were some around the edges and in the native vegetation next to the plantations, but not inside. Whereas in these smaller fields, these smaller orchards over in the complex landscape where there was a lot more diversity of resources across the landscape, so not even just within the orchards but also surrounding the orchards, there were more wild pollinators around. Similar thing in apple orchards in southeastern Australia. So these two red dots up the top here, so we looked at 3 different landscapes that are the key apple growing regions, so the Shepparton region and Harcourt in Victoria and Batlow in southern New South Wales. So this was really interesting. we had a mix of different types of orchards on a scale of different management intensities. So these two red dots are both in Shepparton, and you can see they both have significantly higher numbers of pest insects versus beneficial insects, so pollinators and natural enemies, versus compared to these other orchards that are further down the bottom of the graph. The most interesting thing to me was that one of these orchards, so SG up here, is actually a certified biodynamic orchard. It's managed quite nicely from an environmental perspective, yet it still had this high level of pests. It was embedded in a landscape of mostly intensive conventional agriculture. And we think that was what was going on here, and this is something that's been found also overseas, that there are these interaction effects between what's going on the farm versus what's happening in the landscape. So even though you might be doing sustainable management practices on your individual farm, if the landscape itself doesn't support source populations of beneficial species, it can affect what happens. And that's just the landscape shot, so they're all at the same scale of our three study sites. You can see there's very little native veg left around Shepparton. I think it has one of the highest rates of land clearing in Victoria. I think there's something like less than 10% of the original forest cover left in that district compared to the other two regions where we do have some native veg around. So I think one of the key aspects to establishing more sustainable agricultural practices is the communication and the challenges surrounding that, partly because of the ambiguity of the term, and it is used in such a multitude of ways. A key issue is disciplinary silos, and this isn't just within academic disciplines, although that is also a problem. Traditionally, ecologists generally focus on particular systems and views. Agricultural scientists focus on different types of systems, and then we have all the social sciences and economics, etc., that all do their own thing. But this is also outside of academic research. So Rosemary mentioned the issue with science and business mismatch, science and policy. We all know that these mismatches exist, and it's about working out how to actually cross those boundaries. But it's not always the fault of academics and scientists. I think that both sides do need to meet at the table. So the scientific method, again, a lot of the existing scientific knowledge has on sustainable agricultural practices or how agricultural management affects biodiversity or ecosystem function has been done under this traditional scientific method, which is very objective, reductionist, look at isolated components, which is fine, but then we have this mismatch with this idea of sustainability, which is a very value-rich concept. It's very contextual. What works in one system may not work in another system, etc. Again, we have very limited relevant research here in Australia, so we know a lot about what works on farms as regards environmental sustainability, but a lot of that research has been done overseas. We're very far behind on that front. In particular, we have very limited understanding of the ecology underlying ecosystem services, so a lot of the ecosystem services research in Australia has been more economic accounting based or focused on biophysical processes like water, resource use, soil, vegetation management, etc. We don't know much about how ecological interactions between wild animals and vegetation impact production and how we can manage landscapes to optimise the benefits, like I was saying before. Trade-offs and synergies are another really important point, and again this because the nature of ecosystem services research has traditionally been to look at individual components, so pollination people will just look at pollinators in the system and what they're doing, but the reality is that the yield of the fruit that we want to, that is the factor of interest, is actually driven by a lot of different things going on in that system. You can't just relate it to pollinators or pests or some individual system. And climate extremes as well. So Carl was mentioning yesterday about these compound events which are happening more frequently, and this is something that we still don't know in Australia how we can manage agricultural systems to be more resilient to these effects. And finally, this is a really important point, as I mentioned before, with the animals, this idea of simplified dichotomies, which we all love. It's easy. It's easy to talk about. It's easy to say, oh, we can just do this and it'll fix everything. These are good, these are bad, get rid of those. It doesn't work like that, obviously. We all know that, but often policies and practice systems don't always reflect this complexity. Another really important point, results to transition to sustainable agricultural practices, it takes time. So a lot of the research done from overseas, obviously, again, there's not much from Australia, on transitioning from conventional agricultural practices to organic or similar systems show that the changes and the improving the ecosystem function in the system can take 5 or more years. So often when a farmer makes the decision to change, in the first year, often their yields decline quite significantly. And things might get worse, pests might increase, etc., as the system is adjusting to those changes. But often that's the point where they give up. They think, oh, well, it got worse, so I'm going to go back to what I was doing before because that was working. And this is something that I think this transition period is important, and there's very little support for that. Like if a farmer doesn't have enough of their own capital behind them, it's often more risky to keep going just in case it might work. So understanding how we can manage that risk and encourage people to continue through that transition even when it may not be going in the direction that it looks like it should be. I think these 3 systems concepts, which seem complicated and complex, but I think they're really key communication tools in opening up the discussion about sustainable agriculture. Agroecology, again, is another misinterpreted word. It's not just about smallholders in global south countries. There's this attitude that I have come across a bit here in Australia that it's not relevant here because we're a westernised developed country. We don't need to talk about agroecology. That's for traditional farming landscapes in other countries. Agroecology is simply a term to consider the entire food system. So it's not just about agricultural production. It's about considering who the consumers are, who the producers are, who the middle people are, how all of these things work together. Sustainable agricultural systems are about the people all around them, not just the food production. Ecosystem services, another misunderstood concept. It's not all about dollars and accounting and putting values on things. The vast bulk of the research to date has been focused on that economic accounting side of ecosystem services, which is really important, and it helps us to come up with ideas and policies about how to manage things. But we also really need to understand the ecology underlying those services. Ecosystem services is about the ecology of a system. So if we don't know who's interacting with who and what those outcomes are, we can't then know what the services are going to be and how we can manage them. And the final one is this idea of multifunctional landscapes, which again places people, nature and production together within a single system. And I think that is the key to sustainability. Instead of moving nature and people out of systems, we need to be integrating them and working out how to, sometimes with compromises, it's not going to be perfect for everything, but there does need to be that integration. And I'll just finish on this quote. There's a lot of, again, definitions for multifunctional landscapes, like with everything, but I really like this particular one, which really illustrates that idea of this landscape being an ecological fabric that we are all part of. Thank you.
Thank you, Manu. That was fantastic. Really good example of the benefits of cross-disciplinary or multidisciplinary projects to natural resource management. Next, we have Dr. Catherine Taft, who is the General Manager at Arid Recovery, which is a 123 square kilometre predator-proof reserve in the far north of South Australia. And if you haven't had the chance to visit Arid Recovery, I strongly recommend that you do so. It's an incredible landscape, incredible managers, and Cath's got beautiful kids as well who help run the reserve They're only 4 and 2, but they do a great job.
Right. Thanks for the introduction, Jen. She's in love with my kids, so as am I. Today I'll be talking about, a story of a journey towards conservation solutions, and the successes and the challenges and the rocky points and some of the other spin-offs along the way, I guess. So on today, in this hottest day of April for the state, we're also in the driest state of the driest continent, and I'm taking you north to the arid zone where it's drier still. This area here near Roxby Downs is actually the driest part of the country, and it has a very particular, very fragile ecosystem as a result that's adapted over millennia to those conditions. But that's symptomatic of a much wider area. Australia's arid zone is truly enormous and makes up most of the continent. So conservation in this area is a very, very significant concern because it's such a large space and a huge component of the global biodiversity. And at risk, a very familiar story to all of you, I'm sure, the major risks operating presently on the mammal biodiversity, particularly in this region, are invasive species, starting with the rabbit, which invaded, was the first species to turn up, and a major consumer of vegetation, and also a major supporter of these predators that are great rabbit eaters, and they inflate the numbers of feral cats and foxes in the landscape by being a huge food source for them. So these are the challenges operating, and here's the sad story. I've selected a range of species that used to occur in our area near Roxby Downs. The animals on the left-hand side are still persistent, and they represent about the 40% of species that remain in that area. But in the last 100 years, 60% of the species have disappeared, and around 21% of those black circles permanently disappeared. In fact, one of them, this one on the bottom left, is a pig-footed bandicoot. It's a species that fascinates me, and I have a good friend who works in a natural history museum, and his theory is that the pig-footed bandicoot might have been evolving to become a marsupial ungulate with hooves, which is a challenging thing for a group of animals that need to have grasping hands to climb from the birth canal into the pouch to then go back to having a hoofed foot. But we'll never know because it's gone. Fortunately, though, and really by a stroke of luck, those animals in the middle are still with us. They went extinct from the mainland, or have grossly contracted from where they used to be. And many of them have survived on offshore islands just by a quirk of fate. So we are fortunate, and that presents an opportunity to bring some of them back. And that's the start of the arid recovery story. I've only been with arid recovery for a couple of years after a longer association going back a bit. But it was all started by this couple, John Reid and Catherine Mosby, who may be familiar to some of you. John was the environmental guy at the Olympic Dam mine in the 80s, and could see some of the devastation around him in the arid zone, and particularly was concerned about rabbits. When the Khaleesi virus came through in the 90s, he saw an opportunity to actually fence rabbits out completely from an area, and in doing so exclude feral predators as well. And then that's evolved into doing reintroductions and ecosystem restoration. And he's very much supported by his talented wife, Catherine Mosby, and these other co-founders, Peter Copley from the State Department here, has been a really major part of the organisation right through, and also Professor David Payton from Adelaide University. He's up with us right now doing a field school with 30-odd students up there. And the first step was to fence out the ferals. So this is the arid recovery fence. It's a simple idea, really, and in the initial stages it underwent some rigorous testing with feral cats put inside a pen with different designs to see how long it would take them to get out, and if so, how, until a design was tweaked to keep them in. That's the first cat that was stopped by the design, and the key part is this curvy top. We call it a floppy top. It's loose, it's wobbly, and even if cats can leap onto it, they can't get the purchase to get over it. And it's really effective. The reserve was built in stages with much volunteer effort. It's been expanded from the initial area down the very bottom there of 14 square k's to 123 square kilometres. And the fact that it's built into separate compartments, although those lines going through the middle are internal fences, creates this fabulous experimental option. It's essentially a landscape experiment space, so we can apply different treatments in different parts of the reserve, different mixes of species, and measure the response. And that's been really important for us to understand how these arid ecosystems work, how they interact with these reintroduced species, and a whole host of other things I'll mention later. The next stage, after getting the ferals out of the fenced area, which was actually no mean feat and took several years, was to bring back some of these animals. And the first to come in 98 were the greater stick nest rats. These came from an island off Port Lincoln, and the population now at Arid Recovery is the most significant one on the mainland, and a major contributor to the global population size for that species. Stick nest rats are really relatively large native rodents, and they build these fantastic, maybe 4 metres across sometimes, 1.5 metres high, nests out of sticks, and they'll live in those for generations. The next animal was the burrowing bettong in 99. These animals had survived on islands off Shark Bay in Western Australia, and we brought them back in with around 30 individuals, and they've done very well. I'll mention them in a minute. And then also we brought back greater bilbies from a breeding program in Manato. And bilbies there's something a bit special about bilbies because they have actually persisted on the mainland, albeit in greatly reduced range to what they used to occupy. But they've clearly got something going on that's working, and we're endeavouring to understand what that is, and can we apply that to other species potentially. Finally, the western barred bandicoot was brought over in 2001, again from Shark Bay. It turns out the bandicoot we introduced didn't actually occur here. In the end, it's been recently split into multiple species, but those other newly discovered species are well and truly extinct. So it's good to have this bandicoot. And there's this sneaky guy. This is a plains mouse, and it's fairly rare throughout the arid zone compared to what it once was. And as a calicivirus reduced rabbit numbers and also reduced cat and fox numbers in the arid zone, the plains mouse has started to spread back out and reoccupy country, and it turned up of its own accord in the Arid Recovery Reserve in 2006. And it's filthy with them now. They're everywhere. And because they can move through the fence, they're spreading out into the surrounding landscape. So the fence is essentially seeding that landscape with plains mice, which is pretty cool. We haven't had to lift a finger. Throughout the program, we've had intensive monitoring of these reintroduced species and the general ecosystem. This is some example of the track count data we've collected over the years. Some of you might have seen Georgie's talk yesterday about the power of simply counting tracks as a monitoring method. And this shows that there's a meteoric rise in bettongs. They've done very, very well. Bandicoots too, and a lot of these animals, particularly the insectivorous ones like bandicoots, fluctuate incredibly dramatically according to seasonal conditions. So you can see that, but generally they're doing fairly well. And this is a little cameo story about the role some of these animals are contributing to the ecosystem out there. That hole there is a bilby dig. Bilbies dig quite deep, pointy holes, and they're essentially little composting machines because they dig these holes that collect leaf litter and moisture and seeds, and as a result they've actually increased the carbon and nitrogen content in the soil. That graph there shows that inside a bilby dig there's double the amount of carbon compared to the surface soil, and that facilitates germination of seedlings. So in the first 10 years of the fence being up, we've seen an increase in native cypress pine recruitment, mulga recruitment, as a result of this kind of activity, which is pretty cool. And I suppose bilbies are effectively sequestering carbon, you could say. So there you go. So that's where we're at the moment, and I guess arid recovery has had a coming of age as it's come into 21 years this year, and conservation is never a simple matter, and we've started to grapple with some of the complexities that are thrown up, and when you're effectively modifying ecosystems by building fences and reintroducing animals, it presents all sorts of challenges, and by being that agent that's modified the system, we have a pretty extreme responsibility to continue to manage that. So I'll talk you through some of the challenges and some of the bigger issues. Well, one is simply just keeping a fence up. This is after some rain we had last Christmas when, we found that the soil got very, very soggy and the fence got a bit of a lean on it, and this sort of thing happens all the time. Metal rusts, and the reserve has 80 kilometres of fencing. That takes a lot of maintenance, and we're working towards a more sustainable strategy with that. But the other issue with fencing more broadly is the Arid Recovery Reserve at the moment is the largest of its kind in Australia, but it's still a tiny little blip on a massive landscape. And as a conservation solution, it's an important one, a really important interim measure, but can it be the ultimate solution? I don't believe so, and that's what we're moving towards, working out solutions for some of these vulnerable species outside of fences. And it could be a very long game, but you've got to get started. The other issue we're grappling with is the extremely successful burrowing bettong. This is a whole lot of them coming in to drink around a tap. So from the 30 individuals first introduced, there are now around 6,000 in the reserve, and that's having an impact. So I'll just talk you through that quickly. This plant here is the ruby saltbush, a succulent, and the orange line marks the cover that we've estimated for that plant within the reserve over the years, and the blue is the abundance of bettongs. And so there's a clear decline, a clear inverse trend there, and bettongs are great generalist feeders. They can live off bark if they have to in the dry times, and they're probably quite good at competing with other species for food, and they like eating saltbush. And that's a problem potentially for the stick-nest rat, which is much more specialist in its feeding. It really likes succulent salt bushes. And we've seen this trend that seems to be fairly closely linked to the rise in bettongs, which is again in blue, and the orange is the stick-nest rat activity. And at around the point that the ruby saltbush cover declined to a very minimal value, the stick-nest rats declined also. So we're concerned about that species and the impact of bettongs, and simply on fostering a balanced ecosystem. I'll talk about what we're doing about it later. One of the other challenges we found that by enclosing animals in a large fenced area, but it's still a fenced area with very few predators, is that they lose their smarts. And we've attempted on a few occasions to reintroduce bilbies and bettongs outside of the fence, and they've always failed. They've always ended up like that. We've even tried to address the issue of these animals not having prior exposure to predators by chasing them with stuffed cats and spraying them with a bottle of cat urine to get the message that cats are scary. And it did work for a little while, but the message didn't stick. So again, I'll talk about the new tack we're taking there in a minute. But more broadly, I guess, to gear up for looking outside of the fence and taking advantage of what we have established, we've separated the compartments of the reserve into a core conservation zone where we're maintaining populations of these vulnerable species and continuing to monitor them, and an experimental zone. Because it's fenced, it allows us to test in a controlled way some new ideas and to simulate outside the fence situations. So we've divided it up that way. Okay, going back to the bettong issue, having too many bettongs, and I'll just touch on some of the things that we're trying to tackle there, and we're very much in the middle of this at the moment. We're doing some research with collaborators to trial contraceptives as a method. It may not be feasible on our scale, but it seems to be somewhat effective, and I hope it will be useful for other groups elsewhere. We've generated these little one-way gates, which is essentially a cat flap, but it's a one-way exit to allow these animals to disperse. But because they've been confined, their natural processes would have been to disperse, and this allows them to do so. but it's very much contingent on us doing some very intensive predator control around the reserve to give the bettons the best chance we possibly can. And we're working with some researchers from Melbourne Uni to understand how that's going. And finally, in next month, we'll be introducing a native predator. And really, this is the ideal solution because we hope that they'll be able to regulate the herbivores of their own accord. So in May, we'll be releasing the Western quoll. We're bringing 10 individuals from Western Australia over and taking 2 from the Flinders Ranges. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens. So watch that space. Right, so looking outside the fence again, the main problem that these animals have to tackle if they are to survive outside are feral cats and foxes and other predators. So we've really invested a lot of time in researching better ways to manage that threat. So things like testing baits, aerial deployment of baits for cats, that's something we've been part of. Profiling cats and understanding which cats are the greatest threat. So the image up there is the stomach contents of one cat over a night's hunting, but it's extremely variable. So one cat might have eaten 20 lizards, another one will have eaten 1 rabbit. So we're trying to profile which are the problem cats and are there ways we can target them. That's very much Catherine Mosby's work. We've been testing these new devices. That's John Reid there with his Felix grooming traps. We've just done a big test of those within the reserve to prove how effective they are, and as he moves towards commercialisation of these traps, which are a pretty smart, very targeted feral cat control method, which could be really useful in the toolkit. Right, but one of the real challenges, as much as we might be able to control feral predators outside of fences, one of the bigger challenges is the animals themselves that many of these species have been isolated on offshore islands without even native predators for a very, very long time. And while somewhere deep in the back of their brainstem, surely they should have some memory of what it is to be terrified of being eaten, it's very evident that they lack that at the moment. If you ever come to Arid Recovery and meet some bettons, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. They're very friendly, which is delightful. But it's a real problem for their future. So rather than chasing animals with stuffed cats, we've actually taken the tack of exposing them to the real thing in a controlled situation. So we've actually put bettons and bilbies in with feral cats in one of those experimental parts of the reserve so that they can learn to coexist. And it's in a controlled fashion because it's contained. We can manage the number of cats and monitor it very closely on a monthly basis. And that allows us to expose these animals to the very direct threat. Some of the bettons will be chased by cats, they'll have a near miss and learn a valuable lesson, some will be eaten. So there'll be some level of natural selection applied to the population over time, we hope. And it's early days yet, but we're seeing some behaviour change in the bettons. They're more wary where they've lived with cats, they're more vigilant, and they'll run away faster as you approach them. So that's encouraging, but more importantly, we've actually seen them coexisting with cats over 3 years, and the bettong population in that time has more than doubled. So that gives us a fair bit of hope, but it could still be a long game. So we'll see. We'll see where we go. But, that's the roadmap for the future, and I'll just finish by saying that Arid Recovery's contribution, I guess, to the state and the country in terms of training up young conservationists has been really quite large. They've had over 250 students come through in one shape or form over the years, and lots of interns and volunteers, and many of these people go on to do great work. So it's wonderful to be part of that community, and I look forward to much more of it. Thanks.
Thank you, Kath. That was fantastic. When I went up there last year, one of Kath's sons is still learning to speak and couldn't pronounce bettong. So he called, what is it? It's ping pongs. So I found it very hard ever since then in writing briefings and papers within the department to not call bettongs ping pongs. Because, as Kath said, they are incredibly friendly. They curl up on your lap while you're trying to eat. They follow you around the reserve. They're gorgeous. But once you hear a 3-year-old call them in a very cute voice, these are ping pongs, you can't call them bettongs again. So I'm going to take questions for Kath first, and then questions for the other keynotes as we start to move into the panel. So any particular questions for Kath?
Hello, I'm Pauline from up in the Northern Adelaide Plains. I'd like to know, you've mentioned the preying animals. What about birds of prey? Are there any up in your area that you have to address as well?
Birds of prey as predators? Yes, they are a significant predator. Actually, some years ago we trialled a release of numbats into the reserve, and it ultimately failed because of predation by native birds, brown falcons. Yeah, and I think it's probably an overlooked factor in a lot of reintroductions that there are all these in situ native predators, like goannas and snakes and so on, and they are a significant overlying factor quite on top of all these other things. So, yeah.
Invasive species have been cited in quite a number of presentations as a major problem. Is Australia doing any better now than it has before in controlling cats and foxes and those and rabbits, and the major ones? Are we doing any better now than we did before?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think reserves like this that can completely exclude the threat of invasive predators are really a critical step. Otherwise, we're liable to lose species. But in the long term, I guess, in terms of, say, eradication, we have an incredibly long way to go. And while we're developing better tools, at a full landscape level, it's still an enormous problem. You can eradicate invasive species from larger and larger islands now, but a continent is just a totally another game. It's a huge thing.
I was just wondering, with Arid recovery, it seems to be in a much more stark landscape. How viable would the model of conservation that you use in Arid recovery be in other environments, so say like mangroves or rainforest type area? Like, is this model exclusive to the Arid zone?
No, not at all, and others have done similar kind of fencing projects in other environments. You present different challenges, like water flowing is a real issue, trees falling and so on, but they can be dealt with, and I think there's a real need to look at the vulnerabilities in our species and those that are really not doing well without that kind of refuge protection, and to put new ones into areas of greatest need, and there's quite a lot of work in that space nationally, which is good to see.
Two quick questions. Have you taken any of the bilbies or bettongs and given them to other groups because of the fact that you've got a large number of bettongs? And the second question was just about the cat and bettong interaction. Did you actually feed the cats supplementary food, or did you just leave them to have nothing but to eat the bettongs?
Yeah, so the first question was about giving animals off to other groups. Yes, wherever we can. That's part of the raison d'etre, really, is to share animals and help other groups doing the same thing. Opportunities are somewhat more limited, though, especially on the numbers that we're talking about that we really need to reduce. So, yeah, it's not a full solution to our overpopulation problem, but it's certainly something we're pushing. And the other question was about feeding cats. No, so we give the cats, they're just there, they eat whatever they choose to eat. There are also rabbits in that compartment, so they do eat quite a lot of that, and they eat a lot of small mammals. Actually, if you're around tomorrow, I'll be talking about feral cats in that experiment, which they've done some very interesting things, so check that out.
We're going to quickly set up for the sustainability panel, and I'm going to introduce Mary-Ann Healy, who is the director of the AW region in South Australia. And Mary-Ann can say the full name because I mess it up every time. It's not like ping pongs.
I'm not sure I've quite got it yet either, but Alanyara-Willuara region, which means northwest, so out from Sajuna.
Thank you. So can the panel members, would you mind coming and having a seat? Thank you.
Good morning. Good to be here with you all. You'll notice that we've got an additional panel member. For those of you who weren't at dinner last night, Richard McLennan has joined the panel this morning. Richard is the CEO of Northern Agricultural Catchments Council in Western Australia. So welcome. Thanks for joining us. So this morning's panel is really to talk a bit about natural resource management and sustainability, I guess. So it was just a chance to pick up on some of the themes from your presentations this morning and just talk explore those a little bit more. As we've talked about, natural resource management aims to ensure that the environment is managed in a way that provides social, economic and environmental benefits. And so you've talked about economically sustainable farms. We want to see thriving regional communities, people with strong connection to country and resilient ecosystems. But I think it was you, Manu, that picked up that sometimes these are presented as if they're in tension with each other, as though, you know, it's one or the other, it's a trade-off. And a key challenge, as you've highlighted, is how do we help support decision makers so that it's not such a trade-off. So I might start with you, Rosemary, and ask you a question. How do you see environmental and social outcomes being considered by large financial institutions that impact on the environment?
So, is that working? Great. Within financial institutions now, the discipline of what's called environmental, social and governance risk is actually helping those considerations come into mainstream decision making within the finance sector, whether you're an insurer, asset manager or a bank. So in our credit policies, we're requiring bankers to actually look more closely at the practices of our customers, driven by our natural value strategy, which was one of the areas in our environmental agenda. We're on a mission, I guess, to prove that good land and biodiversity management practices will actually improve resilience and productivity of our agri customers, and that will lead to better outcomes, and for us that's lower credit risk as well.
Thanks, Rosemary. Which might take me on to Manu. You picked up, I guess that at the moment sustainable agriculture is effectively you volunteer, you choose to do that and you're kind of on your own, it feels like. How do you think financial institutions and government could influence the ability for farmers to make more both environmental and socially responsible is not the word, but decisions combined with economic outcomes?
I think, there is no single answer. I mean, it sounds trite, but it's the truth. And I think it is, there still needs to be a lot more discussion and knowledge creation before we know what solutions are for a lot of systems. But ultimately, I think that is the key issue I mentioned about the disciplinary silos, and not just within academia. I think that is the key thing, is that all of these interacting sectors tend to just kind of get on with their own business a lot and do their own thing with regard to a lot of these issues. And I think more integration and understanding of these social, economic, environmental needs across the board, rather than trying to work out which one is more important, if that makes sense.
Is there anywhere that anyone on the panel is seeing that done well, or is seeing it even attempted? I mean, you're certainly working on it at the bank. Is there any other examples where you can think of where policy or business is really sort of trying to work with individuals?
There, within the finance sector, through the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative and the Global Canopy Programme, there's what's called the Natural Capital Finance Alliance. There is also the Natural Capital Coalition, which has developed a protocol to actually engage business in really thinking about biodiversity and ecosystem services and the role that that plays in the fact that it's underpinning the economy. The language in there that I think is unique is it takes the view, extends the view of environment past the impacts we have to the dependencies that we have on it. Because once you start having a conversation about how much business depends on environment, it changes the game in why you would then think about conserving it.
Yes, Sarah. I think you touched on a really important subject, and it's something that we discussed at the dinner last night, actually, which is, and I really wonder how many people would identify from being from big business in this room, apart from Rosemary. That's a sum total of no one. I think we have a problem in Australia. I mean, Rosemary, you aside, because you come to things, you're great and you're a fantastic contributor, but we have really, really struggled to engage big business in biodiversity. And I don't think it's just us. I mean, we were discussing last night that the previous Threatened Species Commissioner had as his major initiative to generate funding for the program engagement with business. Now, I think he would even admit that he completely and utterly failed at that. It was impossible to get people to come on board. And I think we need to really consider why this is in this country, that big business is so unwilling to get on board with natural resource management, because I think it's a massive problem, and we're probably really missing that voice in these fora.
Yeah, thanks.
And I think that there is some dabbling in this area with corporate social responsibility and firms doing a little bit, but there's nothing at the scale that needs to happen. But there are some real bright lights, and I look at two good examples from Western Australia. One is a group called Wide Open Agriculture that is supported by another group called Common Land. And Common Land is a Dutch business, and it's very much a philanthropic approach to getting real change along the lines that Manu was talking about in agriculture and financing regenerative agriculture in particular in the Netherlands and South Africa and now Western Australia. So that kind of initiative. And another one is carbon neutral, working in our area, which is largely been going through this very difficult carbon financing period with corporate philanthropic support. And so this kind of initiative, I think, is developing, and that gives me quite some hope.
Mm.
Yeah, just to add, I think internationally there are plenty of examples, and other countries are far ahead on this. I know France, for example, has just recently incorporated agroecology into their political framework and into their policies, and it's now becoming legislative and regulatory. Switzerland as well, I think, is doing things, and a lot of European countries are ahead, but there are these examples where they've already started to incorporate them into their legal and political frameworks.
Great, thanks. I'm sorry, I'm just stuck on agroecology. I'm picturing all these angry ecologists. But anyway, I'll try and move on from that. Sarah, I've got a question for you. It's kind of into the detail a bit. I had to write down renovation-ageddon, or renovate-ageddon. I quite like that. I may use it again. You made a compelling case, but I share your view well and truly about the importance of biodiversity and the importance of green space in urban settings. But it's often seen by particularly local government who have to look after it as a cost, as a black hole in the budget, as a big dark, you know, they put lots of resources in, but what do they get back for it? How do you think we can influence that to make sure that urban environment, those kind of green spaces are recognised for the economic, social and environmental benefits they provide? Are there, I guess again, are there places doing it well? Are there good metrics around that people can use?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are places doing it reasonably well. But I think three things. firstly, reframing, as you point out, biodiversity is so often seen as being a problem, and I just think we really desperately need to change the language around biodiversity being a massive asset in cities, and one that you cannot afford to lose any of. We need to, be regenerating and restoring and maximising exposure to nature. So I think the way to do that is, secondly, by being conversant in the benefits. It's not just about, I think the case for doing it, conservation for its own sake in cities is compelling, but the health benefits, who doesn't want to have their child having improved cognitive development?
Yeah.
Who wants to have a higher rate of cancer and diabetes and asthma and allergies? They're such no-brainers. I think it's a total no-brainer. Who wants to have a city where everyone's falling down in a heap every time there's a heat wave? We don't want to have that happening. So I think they're just utterly compelling. It's a cheap way of solving some really major problems. So I think being really conversant. And I think thirdly, we just need to trial all over the place. That's why I'm so excited about Adelaide launching into their sort of urban forest strategy, whatever it's going to be called, urban nature strategy. Because I think there are some such exciting programs that can be rolled out to just demonstrate really the benefits, quite quickly. In Melbourne, there's a great green laneways project that people have totally jumped on board, and it's really enhanced the livability of the inner city. Things like the totem species in schools. What an exciting project. Why aren't we all doing that? It's such a kind of win-win-win-win-win, It's got STEM, it's got cultural awareness, it's the conservation. Schools take up a lot of space. There's a lot of potential to do good conservation in those areas. Wildlife gardening programs, the citizen science stuff that I talked about. So let's just get in there and do it.
Thank you. Yeah, there certainly does seem lots of opportunity, and I think I take your message about reframing it, and we've got to be on the front foot with that. Although then I come back to the gap in the big business and decision makers, not necessarily being in the same space to hear that. So we need to keep working on that. Richard, a question for you. In your role, particularly your current role, I guess, in NRM, there's often regional and remote communities really feel like they're at the really pointy end of where social, economic and environment outcomes meet because, for example, land use change at the point that carbon forestry leads to loss of farming ground or, so there's a land use change and people move away from the region. So it really changes the fabric of that community. Is this dropping in and out? Is it because I'm not? Sorry. How can we ensure... How can we ensure that local communities are sustainable in the light of those changes, those sorts of changes? How can we keep people on country, I guess, is the question.
It's a great question. I think certainly it's one very dear to my heart. Actually, while I've got the mic and I have the power, I just want to have a quick interlude and just say congratulations to the organisers of this conference for the approach to gender that they've done. It's been absolutely brilliant. In a previous role, I was the Affirmative Action Gender Equity Officer for my office. Just joking. No, I think the key question there to me is, as an ecologist, for many years, if you asked me, how do I measure sustainability, I would have said it purely in ecological terms. I can look at the landscape and say, well, that ecosystem is functioning or it's not, or biodiversity has been lost or not. But now working in the NRM sector, it is just one of 4 elements that you must consider. And I think one of the key points in Manu's presentation, there was a bullet point there that said, certainly in that policy context, that farmers play a key role as the land stewards, as the land carers, and the like. And I think the key thing that we're seeing, certainly in more marginal areas, such as where I'm working in the northern wheat belt of Western Australia, is that you are seeing a land use change and the ways in which we are farming. And in that process, we are losing farmers and farming families and whole communities as a result of that. so effectively we're losing these land stewards that Manu was talking about. And I think, if I talk again about a farmer called Stuart McAlpine, he works on a property in a town called Bunteen, and he's part of this regenerative agriculture, wide open agriculture momentum. But Stuart, if you talk to him, once again, he won't talk about the economic sustainability of his farming operation. He'll talk about the fact that their primary school just closed because so many families have moved away and they've lost those kids in the primary school. And once you lose that, you also lose shoppers at the local community store. So now, as an ecologist, I still will look at the landscape and say, that place is in poor shape because the local primary school has just closed and we've lost 5 stewards who were previously looking after that landscape. So I guess to get that kind of true sustainability outcome, what we need is a proactive policy environment that supports these land stewards to stay on the land and to get payment for ecosystem services or whatever, so they can get an economic return to enable them to look after the biodiversity assets that people like Catherine were talking about.
Thanks. We probably have time for just a couple of questions. I see one hand up there.
Given that, this is a question for Rosemary, given that fossil fuels contribute to climate change and that farms that have gas wells on them are not insurable, I've cited one form where a bank has rejected a loan because a property has 4 gas wells on it. Given, aside from climate change, that there is problems with water pollution, soil and air pollution, many health problems for animals and humans, have or are the National Bank prepared to take a stance against giving loans to the fossil fuel companies?
So, what I'll be able to say for you there is we've started, through this work we're doing on climate change, a phased review of the range of sectors that we bank. Last year we started that with, and they're listed in our sustainability report and we mention them in our annual financial report. Last year we started with a review of the coal mining sector, and in December our chairman at our AGM and pre that announced that NAB would no longer lend to new greenfield thermal coal mines. So there is a change in risk appetite. If you actually look across the banking sector in Australia, you will see similar statements being made by banks as we consider these risks.
Thanks. One more question. There's a hand up. Over there.
Thanks. I wanted to bring this subject of off-farm impacts. In particular, you used almonds as an example. The off-farm impacts of water in sustainable agriculture. So we're moving to mega farms, low jobs, and consequent impacts on the water resources. So it seems to me that the government policy is actually moving us away from sustainable agriculture.
Yeah, I can't comment on the water policy. That's not my area. But I think it's more just a case that there is the mismatch between the Commonwealth versus state, who's in charge of what, with the water issue. With agriculture, it's mostly state governance. So the Commonwealth actually, if you look in the Constitution, the Commonwealth actually plays a limited role with regulating, or whatever you want to call it, agriculture. So I'm not going to say what the solutions are. It's just that there are these political, I guess, issues about who is going to be in charge of what area, and that's something for the government, I guess, to work out.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, so I am going to, I guess I pick up just a couple of key messages from this panel and this morning, particularly, I guess, for us and those of us working kind of across the disciplines a bit to really focus on that gap between the science, the policy, the business, and try and get more big business involved. And then that reframing the message, I think, for me, were the two things that I probably took home. Could you join me in thanking the panellists this morning? And now it's time for morning tea, which is back out in the marquee, and then back to sessions, separate sessions in the program. Thanks, everyone. Managed to kill one.
I don't know what's happening with this one.
Yeah. I'm assuming it was probably just going flat, because that could have been the one that Jenny was holding onto the entire time.
Yeah, it's on it.